Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of his ship and tried not to listen to the laughter coming through the radio. The other ships in the fleet were making jokes about his vessel, and he could hear every word. His ship was called the USS Defiant, and it looked nothing like the beautiful alien ships that surrounded it. The Defiant was built from old parts and scrap metal. Its hull was covered in patches of different colors where repairs had been made over the years. Some sections were bright silver, others were dark gray, and a few spots were even painted blue from an old cargo ship. The whole thing looked like someone had built it in their backyard garage. Jake walked to the main window and looked out at the other ships. The Zentari Empire had sent 3 massive vessels that looked like silver arrows flying through space. Their hulls were perfectly smooth and shiny, and they moved without making any sound. The Vorthan Collective had brought ships that looked like they were made of crystal and glass. When the sunlight hit them, they sparkled like diamonds. Then, there was his ship. The Defiant had been humanity's best effort to join the Galactic Alliance fleet. Earth had spent 10 years building it, using every piece of technology they could find. But compared to the alien ships, it looked like a flying junk pile. "Captain," said Commander Lisa Hayes, his second in command. She was a small woman with short brown hair and tired eyes. "Admiral Kexvar wants all ships to report their status." Jake pressed the button on his chair to talk to the alien admiral. "This is the USS Defiant. We are ready for battle, sir." The admiral's voice came back through the speakers. Jake could hear the disrespect in his tone. "Yes, human ship. You will stay at the back of the group. Do not get in the way of the real fighting ships." Lisa's face turned red with anger, but she said nothing. Jake had seen that look before. His whole crew felt the same way. They had trained for 20 years to get to this moment, and the aliens treated them like children playing with toys. Chief Engineer Danny Rogers was working at his station nearby. He was a big man with grease under his fingernails and gray hair. He had been fixing ships since before Jake was born. 20 years of work, Danny said quietly, and this is what we get. Babysitting duty while the pretty ships do the real work. Jake knew how his crew felt. Earth had sent their best people on this mission. Every person on the Defiant was an expert in their job. Lisa had graduated first in her class from the Naval Academy. Danny could fix any machine ever built. There, weapons officer Carl Brown could hit a target from 1,000 miles away. Navigator Amy Chun could plot a course through an asteroid field with her eyes closed. But none of that mattered to the aliens. To them, humans were just primitive creatures who had barely learned to travel between stars. The Galactic Alliance had let Earth join only because they needed every ship they could get. The enemy was coming, and even a junk pile like the Defiant might be useful somehow. The enemy was called the Krex Dominion. They had been moving through space for months, destroying everything in their path. Their ships were alive somehow, made of metal and flesh mixed together. They could change and adapt to any weapon used against them. Every battle with the Krex had been a disaster for the Alliance. Amy Chun looked up from her navigation station. She was young, maybe 25, with black hair tied back in a ponytail. "Captain, I'm picking up signals from the edge of the system. A Krex fleet is coming. They'll be here in about 6 hours." Jake nodded and looked around his bridge. The walls were covered with pipes and wires that would have been hidden inside the alien ships. The seats were made of simple metal and plastic instead of the fancy materials the other ships used. Everything was basic and functional, built to last instead of to look pretty. "All stations, get ready for battle," Jake announced over the ship's intercom. "I know what everyone thinks of us. I know they see us as the weak link in this fleet. But we're still human beings, and we're still here to fight." The crew began their preparations. Danny went to check the engines one more time. Carl started running tests on their weapon systems. Amy plotted several escape routes in case things went badly. Lisa stood next to Jake and watched the alien ships moving into their perfect formations. "Do you think we'll actually get to fight?" Lisa asked. Jake looked at the tactical display showing all the ships in the fleet. The Defiant was marked with a small blue dot at the very back, far from where the real action would happen. "I don't know. But if we do, we'll show them what humans can do when we have to." The radio crackled with voices from the other ships. The alien commanders were discussing strategy and tactics, using words that Jake barely understood. Their technology was so advanced that they could predict exactly how the battle would go. They had computer programs that could calculate every possible outcome. But Jake had something they didn't have. He had 30 human beings who were tired of being laughed at. He had a crew that had been preparing for this moment their entire lives, and he had a ship that might look like junk, but was built by people who knew how to make things work no matter what. The Kreks were coming, and everyone expected the Alliance to lose. The alien ships were too advanced, too perfect, too confident. But Jake had a feeling that sometimes the best weapon was the one nobody expected. Sometimes the ship that looked like junk was exactly what you needed to win a war. He just hoped he would get the chance to prove it. The Krek ships arrived like a swarm of angry insects. They moved in ways that made no sense, twisting and turning through space as if the laws of physics didn't apply to them. Each ship looked different from the others, but they all had the same terrifying appearance. They were made of dark metal that seemed to breathe, with organic curves that pulsed like living tissue. Jake watched from the bridge of the Defiant as the enemy fleet approached. There were at least 50 Krek ships, maybe more. They moved in a loose formation that constantly changed shape, like a school of fish swimming through the stars. Their hulls were covered in what looked like scales or armor plates that shifted and moved. "My God," whispered Amy Chun from her navigation station. "They're huge." The largest Krek ship was 3 times the size of anything in the Alliance fleet. It had long tentacle-like appendages that reached out from its main body, and Jake could see smaller ships attached to these arms like parasites. The whole thing looked alive and hungry. Admiral Kexvar's voice came over the radio, speaking to all ships in the fleet. All vessels moved to attack formation. Prepare to engage the enemy. The Alliance ships began their carefully planned maneuvers. The Zentari vessels moved into a perfect triangle formation, their silver hulls gleaming in the starlight. The Vorthan crystal ships spread out in a line, their weapons charging with bright blue energy. Everything looked exactly like the battle simulations Jake had studied. The Defiant stayed at the back of the formation, just as ordered. Jake felt frustrated watching the other ships move into position, while his crew could only observe. They had trained for years to fight in this war, and now they were forced to watch from the sidelines. "First exchange in 30 seconds, announced Carl Brown from the weapons station. He was a thin man with nervous hands, but Jake knew he was the best shot in the human fleet. "Enemy ships are in range." The battle began with a flash of light that lit up the entire system. The Alliance ships fired their energy weapons all at once, sending hundreds of bright beams toward the Krek's fleet. The display was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Jake had never seen so much firepower released in one moment, but something was wrong. The energy beams hit the Krek ships and simply disappeared. The enemy armor absorbed every shot like it was drinking water. The Krek ships didn't even slow down. "What the hell?" Danny Rogers said from his engineering station. "Those weapons should have torn them apart." The Krek's response was immediate and devastating. Their ships fired back with weapons that looked like living lightning. The energy bolts twisted and curved through space, seeking out the Alliance vessels like guided missiles. When they hit, the results were catastrophic. The first Centauri ship exploded in a ball of fire that Jake could see from 20 miles away. The second ship tried to dodge, but the Krek's weapon followed it and tore through its hull like paper. Within seconds, 2 of the Alliance's most advanced ships were nothing but floating debris. All ships fall back to secondary positions. Admiral Kexvar's voice was filled with panic. Retreat Pattern 7. Implement immediately. But the Kreks weren't interested in letting anyone retreat. Their ships moved with frightening speed, surrounding the Alliance fleet and cutting off escape routes. The perfect formations that had looked so impressive during training were falling apart under the enemy's chaotic attack. Jake watched in horror as ship after ship disappeared from his tactical display. The Vorthan crystal vessels were particularly vulnerable. Their beautiful transparent hulls shattered like glass when hit by Krek's weapons. The crews didn't even have time to send distress signals before their ships were destroyed. Captain, Lisa. Hayes said quietly, "We're receiving a general distress call from the flagship. They're asking for any ship that can fight to help immediately." The bridge fell silent. Everyone knew what that meant. The Alliance was losing, and losing badly. The most advanced military force in the galaxy was being torn apart by an enemy. They didn't understand. Sir, Communications Officer Pete Walker called out, "I'm getting reports from all over the battlefield. The Krek's weapons are adapting to our defenses. Every time we try something new, they counter it within minutes." Jake studied the tactical display. The Krek ships were moving in patterns that made no sense according to military strategy, but somehow they were winning. Their living metal hulls were changing shape as he watched, adapting to each new weapon that was fired at them. "Captain," Lisa said, "our orders are to stay back and observe. We're not supposed to engage." Jake looked at his crew. They were all staring at him, waiting for his decision. These were good people who had dedicated their lives to protecting humanity. They had trained for years to fight in this war, and now they were being forced to watch their allies die. Another explosion lit up the space in front of them. This time it was the Alliance flagship, the most advanced ship in the fleet. Jake could see escape pods launching from the wreckage, but he knew most of the crew was already dead. "Orders change," Jake said finally. "Helm, take us into the battle." Amy. Chun looked up from her station with wide eyes. "Sir, are you sure? If we move toward the fight, the other ships will think we're running away." "No," Jake said firmly. "We're not running away. We're running toward the enemy. Show them what humans do when everything looks hopeless." The Defiant broke formation and began moving toward the center of the battle. Jake could hear surprised voices on the radio from the surviving Alliance ships. Most of them sounded disappointed rather than impressed. "The humans are finally showing their true nature," came a voice from one of the remaining Zentari ships. "Running away when the real fighting starts." Jake smiled grimly. Let them think what they wanted. The Defiant wasn't running away from the battle. It was running straight into the middle of it, toward the largest concentration of Krek ships in the enemy fleet. "All stations, prepare for combat," Jake announced. "We're going to show these aliens what human engineering can do." The crew began their final preparations. Danny pushed the engines to maximum power. Carl charged their primitive kinetic weapons. Amy plotted the most direct course to the enemy. Lisa coordinated damage control teams. As the Defiant approached the Krek's fleet, Jake realized that his ship might be the only hope left for the Alliance. The advanced alien vessels had failed completely against an enemy that could adapt to their sophisticated weapons. Maybe what they needed was something so simple and crude that the Kreks couldn't figure out how to counter it. The ship that everyone had laughed at was about to become the last hope for victory in a war that seemed already lost. The Defiant charged toward the Krek's fleet like a bull running at a pack of wolves. Jake could see the enemy ships ahead of them, their living metal hulls pulsing with organic energy. The Kreks had been so focused on destroying the Alliance's advanced vessels that they hadn't paid much attention to the primitive human ship approaching from behind. "Weapons range in 30 seconds," Carl Brown announced from his station. His hands were steady on the controls, but Jake could see sweat on his forehead. They were about to test human weapons against an enemy that had adapted to everything else the galaxy could throw at them. The Defiance weapons were nothing like the energy beams and plasma cannons used by the Alliance ships. Instead, they were simple kinetic weapons called railguns. They fired solid metal projectiles at incredible speeds using magnetic acceleration. The technology was hundreds of years old by galactic standards, but it was reliable and powerful. "Target the lead ship," Jake ordered. "All weapons, prepare to fire." The Krek ships were still focused on the surviving Alliance vessels, chasing them across the battlefield like predators hunting wounded prey. They had no idea that the ugly human ship was about to attack them from behind. "Firing now!" Carl shouted. The Defiance railguns fired in perfect sequence. 6 solid metal projectiles, each one the size of a telephone pole, shot out from the ship at nearly the speed of light. They were simple chunks of tungsten and steel, nothing fancy or high-tech about them. The first projectile hit the lead Krek ship right in the center of its hull. The impact was devastating. The living metal armor that had absorbed every energy weapon fired at it couldn't handle the raw kinetic force of a solid object moving at relativistic speeds. The projectile punched through the ship's hull like a bullet through paper. "Direct hit," Carl yelled. "Their armor is completely penetrated." The Krek ship shuddered and began to spin out of control. Green fluid leaked from the hole in its hull, and Jake could see internal fires burning inside the vessel. The ship that had seemed invincible moments before was now dying. "Continue firing all weapons," Jake ordered. "Don't give them time to adapt." The Defiance railguns fired again and again. Each shot was a simple kinetic impact, but the results were incredible. The Krek ships had evolved to counter energy weapons, plasma beams, and sophisticated missiles. But they had never encountered anything like humanity's primitive kinetic weapons. A second Krek ship tried to dodge, but the railgun projectile was too fast. It hit the ship's side and tore through 3 decks before exiting out the other side. The ship broke apart like a toy hit by a hammer. "Hull breach on deck 3, called out Damage Control Chief Mary Johnson. "The Kreks are firing back." The enemy's bioenergy weapons lashed out at the Defiant, but something amazing happened. The human ship's armor, which had been designed to handle everything from meteor impacts to nuclear explosions, absorbed the energy blasts without serious damage. The bioenergy weapons that had torn through Alliance shields were having trouble with the Defiant's simple steel plating. "Damage report," Jake called out. "Minimal damage, sir," Mary replied. "Their energy weapons aren't designed to handle our type of armor. It's like they're trying to cut through steel with a tool made for ice." Jake allowed himself a small smile. The Defiant might look like a junk pile, but it was built by people who knew how to make things tough. Every plate of armor had been tested against real weapons. Every system had backup systems and backups for the backups. The tide of battle was starting to turn. The remaining Alliance ships, which had been retreating in panic, began to regroup. They used the Defiant's assault as cover to reorganize their formations and prepare for another attack. "Sir," Pete Walker called from the communication station, "we're getting a message from Admiral Kexvar. He wants to speak with you personally." Jake opened the channel. "This is Captain Morrison of the USS Defiant." Captain Morrison, the Admiral's voice was completely different from before. The arrogance was gone, replaced by respect and amazement. "Your ship's performance has been extraordinary. Can you continue your attack?" "As long as our ammunition holds out, Admiral. But we're going to need support if we want to finish this job." "Understood." All Alliance vessels form up on the human ship, follow their lead, and support their attack. For the first time since the battle began, the Alliance fleet moved as one unit. The ships that had been scattered and confused began to work together, with the laughed-at human vessel leading the charge against an enemy that had seemed unstoppable. The Defiant continued its assault, moving through the Krex fleet like a shark among fish. Every shot from its railguns found its target, and every hit was devastating. The Krex ships tried to adapt their defenses, but evolution takes time, and the battle was moving too fast for them to keep up. "Captain," Amy Chun called from her navigation station, "I'm reading massive energy fluctuations from the Krex command ship. I think they're trying to coordinate a counterattack." Jake looked at the tactical display. The Krex flagship was 3 times larger than any other ship in their fleet, a massive biomechanical construct that pulsed with organic energy. If it could organize the remaining enemy ships, the battle might still be lost. "Danny, what's our ammunition status?" Jake asked. Chief Engineer Rogers checked his displays. "We've got maybe 20% left, sir. We've been burning through our supply pretty fast." Jake nodded. The Defiant had been doing most of the fighting for the past hour, and their weapons were running low on ammunition. But they had proven something important. Human technology might be primitive by galactic standards, but it was effective against enemies that had adapted to everything else. "All ships, this is Captain Morrison," Jake announced over the fleet communication system. "We've shown that the Krex can be beaten. Their adaptive defenses work against energy weapons, but they can't handle simple kinetic impacts. Use everything you've got: mass drivers, missile warheads, anything that hits them physically rather than with energy." The Alliance ships began to modify their tactics. Ships that had been using energy weapons switched to physical projectiles. Vessels that carried mining equipment began firing chunks of metal at the enemy. Even the sophisticated Centauri ships found ways to use their technology to throw solid objects at incredible speeds. The Krex fleet, which had been winning easily just an hour before, was now in complete disarray. Their ships were designed to be perfect predators, capable of adapting to any threat. But they had never encountered prey that fought back with such crude, simple, and effective weapons. Jake watched as another Krex ship exploded under the combined fire of the Alliance fleet. The enemy was retreating now, their perfect formations broken, and their confidence shattered. The ship that everyone had laughed at had shown them the way to victory. The battle was turning in favor of the Alliance, but Jake knew it wasn't over yet. The Krex command ship loomed ahead of them, like a dark mountain floating in space. It was massive, easily 10 times the size of the Defiant, and it pulsed with a sickly green light that seemed to come from within its living hull. "Captain," Science Officer Helen Burke called from her station, "I'm detecting huge energy changes from the Krex flagship. The readings are off the charts." Jake studied the tactical display. The enemy command ship was surrounded by a swirling cloud of smaller vessels, all of them connected by streams of energy that looked like green lightning. The whole formation was changing, adapting, evolving before his eyes. "What are they doing?" Jake asked. "I think they're sharing information," Helen replied. "The flagship is learning from every hit we've made on their other ships. They're adapting their defenses to counter our kinetic weapons." Jake felt his heart sink. The Krex had been caught off guard by human weapons, but they were fast learners. If they could adapt their defenses to handle kinetic impacts, the Alliance would be back where they started. "How long before they figure it out?" Jake asked. "Unknown, sir. Could be minutes, could be hours. But based on what we've seen, I wouldn't bet on hours." The Defiant was running low on ammunition after the sustained battle. Their railgun magazines were nearly empty, and the other Alliance ships were having the same problem. They had been fighting for 2 hours straight, and their supplies were running out. "Danny, what's our status on the special package?" Jake asked quietly. Chief Engineer Rogers looked up from his console with a grim expression. "Ready to deploy, sir." "Oh, I still think this is the craziest plan I've ever heard." A special package was something that would have been impossible on any other ship in the fleet. While the Alliance vessels relied on sophisticated energy weapons and computer-controlled systems, the Defiant carried something much more primitive and much more dangerous. Hidden in the ship's cargo bay were 12 nuclear warheads, each one built using technology that was centuries old by galactic standards. The Alliance had banned nuclear weapons decades ago, considering them too crude and dangerous for civilized warfare. But Earth had built them anyway, just in case. "Helen, I need a firing solution on the command ship. One shot, maximum range, maximum yield." Helen's face went pale. "Sir, if we get close enough to use those weapons, we won't survive the blast. The radiation alone will kill us." "Then we better make sure we don't miss," Jake replied. "Amy, plot an intercept course with the flagship. Full speed." Navigator Amy Chun's hands shook as she entered the coordinates. "Course laid in, sir. 12 minutes to optimal firing position." Jake opened a channel to the entire crew. "All hands, this is the captain. We're about to attempt something that's never been done before. We're going to take out the Krex command ship with weapons that the galaxy forgot existed. I won't lie. To you, this is dangerous. But if we succeed, we can end this war right here, right now." The Defiant accelerated toward the massive enemy flagship, drawing the attention of every Krex ship in the area. Bioenergy weapons reached out like tentacles, trying to stop the human vessel before it could get close enough to be dangerous. Hull breaches on multiple decks. Mary Johnson reported from damage control, but we're still holding together. The ship shuddered under the enemy fire, but its crude armor and redundant systems kept it moving forward. Jake could hear the groaning of metal and the hiss of escaping air, but the Defiant refused to die. 8 minutes to firing position. Amy announced. Jake opened a channel to the entire Alliance fleet. "All ships, this is Captain Morrison. In 6 minutes, we're going to light up the Krex command ship with everything we have. When we do, I want every weapon in the fleet targeting that vessel. This is our chance to end this war once and for all." The response was immediate. Alliance ships began moving into position, their remaining weapons charging for what everyone hoped would be the final strike. The Zentari vessels formed a line behind the Defiant, their surviving energy weapons ready to support the attack. The Vorthan ships spread out in a wide formation, preparing to catch any Krex vessels that tried to escape. 5 minutes to firing position, Amy called out. The Krex command ship was growing larger in the main view screen. Jake could see details on its hull now. Organic ports that opened and closed like breathing, metal tentacles that writhed like living things, and weapon systems that looked more like body parts than machines. 4 minutes. The enemy ship was responding to their approach. More bioenergy weapons were firing at the Defiant, and Jake could see smaller Krex vessels detaching from the flagship's hull, like antibodies responding to an infection. 3 minutes. The Defiant's hull was taking serious damage now. Whole sections were without power, and the ship's speed was dropping as the engines struggled to maintain thrust. But they were still moving, still fighting, still refusing to give up. 2 minutes to firing position. Jake looked around his bridge at his crew. These were the people who had been laughed at, dismissed, and ignored by the galaxy. But they were still here, still fighting, still believing in their mission. Lisa Hayes was coordinating damage control efforts while monitoring the tactical situation. Danny Rogers was pushing the engines beyond their design limits. Carl Brown was preparing their final weapon with steady hands. 1 minute. The Krex flagship. filled the entire view screen now. Jake could see the individual armor plates on its hull, each one pulsing with organic energy. The ship was beautiful in a terrifying way, like a work of art designed by nightmares. "Firing position achieved," Amy announced. "Carl, launch the package," Jake ordered. "Package away." The nuclear warhead shot out from the Defiant's launch tube, a simple metal cylinder that looked tiny compared to the massive enemy ship. It accelerated toward the Krex flagship at incredible speed, its primitive guidance system locked onto the target. "All ships, fire everything you have." Jake shouted over the fleet communication system. The Alliance fleet opened fire with every weapon they had left. Energy beams, kinetic projectiles, and explosive missiles all converged on the Krex command ship at the same moment. The nuclear warhead reached its target. The explosion was like a miniature sun being born in the darkness of space. The nuclear fusion reaction tore through the Krex flagship's biomechanical armor like it was made of paper. The primitive human weapon, dismissed by the galaxy as barbaric and outdated, released more destructive power than anything the Alliance had ever seen. The light was so bright that it temporarily blinded everyone on the bridge. When Jake's vision cleared, the Krex command ship was gone. In its place was an expanding cloud of superheated gas and debris, glowing with the aftermath of nuclear fire. "Direct hit," Carl shouted. "The command ship is completely destroyed." Around the battlefield, the remaining Krex vessels began to falter. Without their flagship's coordinating influence, their perfect formations dissolved into chaos. Ships that had moved like parts of a single organism suddenly became individual units, confused and leaderless. The Alliance fleet didn't waste the opportunity. They pressed their attack against the scattered enemy ships, using the confusion to destroy targets that had seemed impossible to defeat just hours before. Jake slumped in his command chair, exhaustion finally catching up with him. The Defiant had taken massive damage during the final assault, and half his crew was in the medical bay, but they had survived, and more importantly, they had won. The ship that had been laughed at had just ended the war. The silence after the explosion was deafening. Where the massive Krex command ship had been just moments before, there was nothing but empty space filled with glowing debris. The nuclear warhead had done its job completely, vaporizing the enemy. Flagship and everything on it. Jake sat in his captain's chair, hardly able to believe what had just happened. The Defiant was badly damaged, with hull breaches on 6 different decks and half their systems offline. But they were still alive, still fighting, and most importantly, still winning. "Status report," he called out to his crew. "The Krex fleet is breaking apart," Amy Chun reported from her navigation station. "Without their command ship, they're scattered and confused. Most of them are trying to retreat. Our weapons are empty, but our engines are still working," Danny Rogers added from engineering. "We can move, but we can't fight anymore." Jake looked at the tactical display. The remaining Krex ships were indeed falling back, their perfect formations completely destroyed. Some were fleeing toward the edge of the system, while others seemed to be wandering aimlessly through space like lost children. The Alliance fleet was pursuing them, pressing their advantage while they still could. The Zentari ships were using their speed to cut off escape routes, while the Vorthan vessels were picking off stragglers with their remaining weapons. For the first time since the battle began, the Alliance was winning. "Captain, communications." Officer Pete Walker said, "I'm getting reports from across the entire sector. The Krex forces are retreating from all 3 star systems. The war is over." Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. 3 years of fighting, 3 years of losing battle after battle, and it was finally over. The galaxy was safe, and humanity had played a part in saving it. "Pete, open a channel to the fleet," Jake ordered. "Channel open, sir." "This is Captain Jake Morrison of the USS Defiant To all Alliance vessels, the Krex threat has been eliminated. The war is over. All ships return to base for repairs and medical treatment. The response came from Admiral Kexvar himself. The alien commander's voice was completely different from when the battle had started. The arrogance and dismissal were gone, replaced by respect and amazement. Captain Morrison, on behalf of the entire Galactic Alliance, I want to formally apologize for our earlier treatment of your vessel and crew. Your actions today have saved not just this fleet, but possibly the entire galaxy. Jake smiled as he looked around his battered bridge. His crew was exhausted, injured, and covered in smoke and grease, but they were grinning from ear to ear. They had done something that nobody thought was possible. They had taken the ship that everyone laughed at and used it to win a war. No apology necessary, Admiral, Jake replied. We're just glad we could help. Over the next few hours, the full scope of their victory became clear. The Krex hadn't just been defeated in this one battle. Their entire war machine had collapsed. The destruction of their command ship had sent a signal to Krex forces throughout the galaxy, and they were all retreating back to their home territory. The Alliance fleet began a long journey back to their base stations. But this time, the Defiant wasn't traveling alone at the back of the formation. It was surrounded by an honor guard of the same ships that had knocked it just hours before. The alien commanders were requesting permission to escort the human vessel home. Captain, Lisa Hayes said quietly, we're receiving messages from Earth. The news has already reached home. They want to know when we're coming back. Jake thought about Earth, about the people who had built this ship and trained this crew. They had been dismissed by the galaxy as primitive and backward, but they had proven that sometimes the simplest solutions were the most effective. Tell them we'll be home soon, Jake replied, and tell them that humanity has found its place in the galaxy. A journey back to Earth took 3 weeks. During that time, Jake and his crew became celebrities throughout the Alliance. Every news service in the galaxy wanted to interview them. Every military academy wanted to study their tactics. Every shipyard wanted to examine their weapons. Defiant became the most famous ship in the galaxy, not because it was the most advanced or the most beautiful, but because it had proven that courage and determination could overcome any obstacle. The crew that had been laughed at were now being hailed as heroes. But Jake knew the real victory wasn't in the fame or the recognition. It was in the fact that his crew had never given up, even when everything looked hopeless. They had taken their simple, crude, primitive ship and used it to save the galaxy. When they finally arrived at Earth, the entire planet was waiting for them. Ships from every nation filled the space around their home world, all of them there to welcome the heroes home. The Defiant, with its patched hull and mismatched armor, looked more beautiful than any vessel in the fleet. Jake stood on the bridge one last time as they approached Earth's orbital station. His crew was gathered around him, tired but proud of what they had accomplished. They had proven that humanity belonged in the galaxy, not as junior partners or comic relief, but as equals. You know, Danny Rogers said, wiping grease from his hands, I never thought I'd say this, but I'm actually going to miss this old bucket of bolts. Don't worry, Jake replied with a smile. Something tells me they're going to want us to build more ships like this one. The Defiant docked at the station to a hero's welcome. The crew was greeted by cheering crowds, military bands, and reporters from across the galaxy. But Jake knew that the real victory was much simpler than all the celebration. They had taken a ship that was laughed at and used it to win a war. They had shown the galaxy that sometimes the most effective weapon wasn't the most advanced one, but the one that nobody saw coming. They had proven that humans, with their crude technology and primitive weapons, could stand alongside the greatest civilizations in the galaxy. The war was over, and humanity had won it with nothing more than courage, determination, and the willingness to fight when everyone else had given up hope. The Defiant and its crew had shown that sometimes the best way to win a war wasn't with the most advanced technology, but with the most determined people. As Jake walked through the corridors of the space station, he was stopped by countless beings from across the galaxy. Centauri officers who had once dismissed him now asked for his autograph. Vorthan scientists wanted to study his ship's design. Even Admiral Kexvar personally thanked him for his service. But the moment that meant the most to Jake came when he was contacted by the families of Alliance crew members who had been saved by his actions. Parents, children, and spouses from dozens of different worlds sent messages of gratitude. They told him that because of what the Defiant had done, their loved ones were coming home alive. 6 months later, Jake stood in a shipyard orbiting Earth, watching as the first of a new class of human warships was being built. They called them Defiant-class vessels, and they combined the best of human engineering with lessons learned from the war. They weren't the prettiest ships in the galaxy, but they were tough, reliable, and effective. The Galactic Alliance had officially invited humanity to become a full member, with all the rights and responsibilities that came with it. Earth was no longer seen as a backward planet on the edge of civilization. It was recognized as the home of the people who had saved the galaxy. When everyone else had failed, Jake's crew had been offered promotions and positions throughout the Alliance fleet. Some had accepted, eager to explore the galaxy and share their knowledge with other species. Others had chosen to stay on Earth, helping to train the next generation of human space crews. Lisa Hayes had been promoted to captain and given command of the second Defiant-class ship. Danny Rogers had been recruited by the Alliance Engineering Corps to help design new defensive systems. Carl Brown was teaching gunnery tactics at the Alliance Military Academy, but Jake had made a different choice. He had turned down offers to command massive fleets and join prestigious academies. Instead, he had requested to stay with the original Defiant, which was being repaired and upgraded for continued service. Why? Admiral Kexvar had asked him during their final meeting. You could command any ship in the fleet. You could have any position you want. Jake had smiled and looked out at the stars. Because someone needs to remember that the best weapons aren't always the most advanced ones. Someone needs to keep the spirit of the Defiant alive. Now, as he prepared for his next mission, Jake reflected on everything that had happened. The galaxy was at peace for the first time in years. The Kreks had retreated to their home territory and shown no signs of renewed aggression. Trade routes were reopening, and different species were working together to rebuild what had been destroyed. Defiant had become a symbol of hope throughout the galaxy. Its image was painted on walls, carved into monuments, and displayed in museums on 100 different worlds. Children played games pretending to be the crew that had saved everyone. Adults told stories about the ship that had been laughed at, until it won the war. But Jake knew that the real lesson wasn't about ships or weapons or technology. It was about people. It was about never giving up, even when everyone else said you couldn't win. It was about believing in yourself and your crew, even when the whole galaxy thought you were a joke. As the repaired Defiant prepared to launch on its next miss,